And now introducing our speaker is Cassidy Murphy.
Well, I am very pleased to announce Nathan Pieplow is here with us today. He is an expert in bird sounds. He has a website called Ear Birding, if I say that right, or if I mispronounce. I read about Nathan on his website, and he said that he started birding when he was very young, and he learned to identify birds from a field guide and the bird call descriptions, which sounds really hard to do from my standpoint. And he went on with his life, came down to Boulder. He is a professor of rhetoric and writing at the University of Colorado. And he continued studying birds, and apparently he says that he does not have a superpower in terms of memorizing bird sounds or recognizing bird sounds. And when he went to study birds in Costa Rica, where Bill is today, and in Mexico, he didn't find the resources he needed. So he ended up making those resources for himself and for others. And now he's written the Peterson's Field Guide to Bird Sounds of Western North America and the Bird Sounds of Eastern North America. And he does talks about bird songs all over, as well as going to places like Siberia to study the birds of Siberia. So we're very pleased to have you here today, Nathan. Take it away.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I understand many of you are joining us from far away. I too am joining you from far away. I am not at home in Boulder right now. I am visiting my brother in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So nice to be able to join you from afar. And let's get this going. Can everybody see that screen? There, we got it. Fantastic.
Yes.
So I'm gonna, and I've got until 45 after, is that correct, on time? I believe so.
Yeah, it's about that, and then if around in there, and then there'll be questions after that.
Including questions, right? So,
oh, not including questions. We'll have questions for about 10 minutes after that.
Okay, great. Yeah, just so I can keep an eye on the clock and not wear you all out, because I can probably talk about bird sounds longer than you can listen. It's just one of those things. But today I want to talk a little bit about what birds are actually saying to one another, because they are communicating, and I want to help you listen in a little bit on what they're saying to one another. We're gonna, let's see if I can get this to go here. There we go. You'll see there on your screen, as the other components have faded away, there's that little squiggle up at the top, and that is actually a bird sound. That is a picture of a bird sound. It's we call it a spectrogram, and it's a computer-generated graph of the sound. So it's a little bit like reading music. Same basic principle, goes from left to right. The high notes are at the top, the low notes are at the bottom. But we're not gonna worry too much about how to read spectrograms today. I just want you to know that every sound has a shape. And occasionally during today's talk, you might see some shapes appear on the screen when a bird is singing. We're not gonna spend a lot of time on that, but if that happens, you're looking at a picture of the sound. So what I do want to talk about is the fact that all around us, all the time, the birds are always telling us who they are and what they're doing. The problem is we don't speak bird, most of us. So we don't understand them when they're saying things. Here's a bird telling us something. That bird just told you that it's a red-winged blackbird. It also just told you that it's a male. And it also told you a few other things, but we'll get to that in a minute. That bird also just told you that it's a red-winged blackbird. It told you that it's a female, and it told you a few other things, which we'll get to in a minute. We can learn the language of the birds if we study and figure out what other people have figured out, and then we can actually listen in on their conversations. For example, that's a bird called a cliff swallow. Cliff swallows are very common in Colorado in the summertime. They nest in big colonies under bridges and culverts. If you walk up underneath the bridge where all the cliff swallows are nesting together, they will all fly out and swarm over your head, and they will say this. Because that little doo noise is the word in cliff swallow language that means danger. But cliff swallows have other words in their language too, like this one. That is a sound that cliff swallows only make on cool, cloudy days in the summertime. Because on cool, cloudy days in the summer, it becomes difficult to be a cliff swallow. Cliff swallows feed on flying swarms of insects. And when it's rainy or drizzly or cold in the summertime, the insects don't fly nearly as much. So what the cliff swallows do is they all spread out from the colony in different directions, hoping that one of them will get lucky and find a swarm of insects that is actually still flying. If they do, they make this sound. And that recruits all the cliff swallows within earshot to come as quick as they can and take advantage of that flying insect swarm while it is still flying. Now, one thing I like to point out is that it's possible that other species of swallows have similar food finding calls to that, but if they do, we have no idea. One of the things that I want to drive home to you today is the fact that I can't teach you all of the languages of the birds because we don't actually know all of them. Actually, very few birds have been well enough studied that we can actually say what they're saying to one another. The only reason we know that cliff swallows have a food finding call is because there's one legendary cliff swallow researcher who kept going back to the same colony of cliff swallows and studying them every summer for 25 straight years in Nebraska. And I think they discovered the food finding call somewhere around year 18 or something like that. So it takes a lot of very detailed field research to try to actually unravel what these signals mean when they're passed from bird to bird and to try to translate them into our own language. And there's actually not very many birds that we've done that with. So in my books, you will often see the words, "more study needed." And that's actually one of the things that I really like about bird sounds is that when you're studying bird sounds, you are standing very close to the frontier of human knowledge. It's much easier to go out in your backyard and record a bird sound that's never been recorded before than it is to go out with a camera and take a photograph of a bird that's never been taken before. Far more people interact with the natural world via cameras than via microphones. And yet we all now have microphones on our cell phones. And so we're at the beginning of an exciting new time when we can actually all go out and help contribute to learning about what birds are saying to one another. Today, I want to talk a little bit about what some birds are saying to one another. We're going to start with this pair of red-winged blackbirds that we've already met and talk a little about them. And we'll keep coming back to them because they're the most fascinating birds in North America and also one of the best studied. So we actually do have a pretty good handle on red-winged blackbird language. And we'll talk about a few other birds as we go. Those are the songs of the male and female red-winged blackbird, and they often duet just like that, where the male starts with his konkari song, and then the female starts singing halfway through her mate's song. So he starts it, and then they overlap for a little bit in the middle, and then she finishes it off. And when they duet like that, they are telling each other, "I love you." This is a pair bonding exercise. Those two songs sound so different that, and because they're always offset like that by about half a second, Actually, most birders don't actually realize that they're listening to a duet when they hear that sound. And you can hear that sound 100 times an hour in any cattail marsh in the United States in the summertime. You can hear this at Cottonwood Marsh, at Walden Ponds, over and over again. When these two birds are duetting, they're not just telling each other, I love you, they're also sending a message to all the other red-winged blackbirds in the marsh. They're also advertising that they're taken, that they have a mate. Or more specifically, they're saying, my mate is taken. So the male red-winged blackbirds will defend their mate against other males. The female will defend her mate against other females. So by duetting, they actually advertise to all the other birds in the marsh that this territory is occupied by a mated pair. Now, male red-winged blackbirds actually have more than one song. The most common song is the one you just heard, that conquerí, but they also have another song that they don't give very often. We call it the flight song because it's usually given in flight. And here's what it sounds like. Much longer and more complicated than the usual conquerí song. And we don't know exactly what this song means, but best we can tell, he gives this to notify his mate that he's leaving the territory and that she has to kind of hold down the fort while he's away. It's a little bit complicated because they don't give this song every time they fly off their territories, and occasionally they'll give it when they're coming back to their territories. But this is a song that you could spend the whole day in the marsh and maybe only hear once or twice. It's much, much less common than that other usual song. Now, female red-winged blackbirds also have two different songs. They first of all have that I love you / I'm taken song that we heard earlier, but they also have a more aggressive song that they use to defend their mate against other females. And you can hear that that song sounds much harsher. It's a much more aggressive kind of sound. And the females actually can mix and match those two songs. They can basically pull notes from either song to create a wider range of emotional signals. So they can be anywhere on that spectrum, basically from get out of my territory to I love you, just by kind of blending those two songs together. When we're talking about bird language, sometimes one sound can have many meanings, and that shouldn't be too surprising because human language works the same way. In the English language, we have a number of different words that sound the same, homonyms, we call them. And we have to figure out which word is which using context. Birds do the same thing. So here's a little bird called the ruby-crowned kinglet. And all winter long, they basically give just this one sound over and over, this chit, chit, chit-it kind of call. In the spring, they sing a beautiful, complicated song, but all winter long, they just give this chit call. And that chit call has to do several different things. It has to keep flocks together by telling the birds where the other birds in the flock are. It has to signal alarm and the presence of danger. And sometimes kinglets use that to recruit other small birds to come and try to drive away an owl or some other small predator. How do the other birds know which of those meanings that chit call has? Well, the birds pay attention to context, just like we do in our language. They're going to pay attention to how active, how excited that bird looks. They're going to pay attention to whether or not his little red crest is raised or concealed. They're going to pay attention to whether he's feeding calmly or whether he seems to be scared. They're going to look around and see if they see any predators. Based on all of these things, they're going to figure out which of those meanings is the intended one. Like I said, that shouldn't be too surprising because our language works the same way. But in bird language, if one sound sometimes has many meanings, it's also true that sometimes one meaning can have many sounds. And for this, we're going to use an example of the bird that, as far as we know, has the largest vocabulary of any bird in the world. And remember what I said earlier, how we haven't studied that many bird sounds. That caveat is a strong one, as far as we know. There could well be 1,000 bird species that have larger vocabularies than this, but as far as we have been able to determine, the bird with the largest vocabulary is this bird. It's called the brown thrasher, and it lives in the eastern United States. They're pretty rare in Boulder, but you can get them in Colorado if you drive out a little farther towards Kansas and Nebraska. They become a pretty common bird. They're a relative of the mockingbird. And they sing this song where they sing a phrase that's about a second long, and then there's about a 1 second pause, and then there's a different phrase, and then there's a pause, and then there's a different phrase, and then there's a pause. And they can go on like this for hours. I'm going to play you a little snippet of the song, and I want you to listen and see if you can tell when and whether the bird starts to repeat itself. I just asked you a very tricky question. The answer to that question is that bird did not repeat itself during that 40-second clip. And if you listen to a brown thrasher, it becomes very challenging to figure out when the bird starts repeating itself, because in order to know that, you have to remember every single thing that the bird has said up to that point. So some researchers wanted to find out how big this bird's vocabulary was. So they went out on the campus of the University of Massachusetts and recorded a single male for 118 straight minutes. So just shy of 2 hours of singing. And they went back to the lab and they made those spectrograms, those images of the sound, and they compared them to look for how often that bird repeated himself. And what they estimated was that that individual brown thrasher had a vocabulary of between 2,000 and 2,500 different phrases in his song. Just to put that in perspective, your vocabulary as an adult speaker of English is probably somewhere on the order of 25,000 words. So here's a bird whose vocabulary is about 10% the size of yours, and its brain is the size of your fingernail. But brown thrashers may be saving some brain space when they are storing all that vocabulary in their heads, because as far as we can tell, every single one of those 2,500 song phrases means the exact same thing. They all mean, I'm a male brown thrasher and I'm looking for someone to share my territory with. Which immediately raises the question, why do you need 2,000 different ways to say that? And the short answer is, we have no idea. This is actually a huge unsolved mystery in science right now, in bird science. The standard answer would be sexual selection. In other words, female choice. The idea would be that at some point in the evolutionary history of the brown thrasher, females developed a preference for males who did not repeat themselves. And so, over time, the males who have the larger vocabularies are the ones who find the mates and pass on their genes, and over time, vocabularies keep getting larger and larger. But the interesting thing is that at this point, sexual selection can no longer explain that many words in brown thrasher language, because the vocabulary has grown so large that we are pretty sure that females are not going to take the time to distinguish between a male who knows 2,200 words and a male who knows 2,500 words. In order for her to do that, she'd have to listen to every male for hours and hours and remember every single thing that they all said. We're pretty sure they're not taking that much time and putting in that much effort. In other words, the vocabulary has grown larger than the ability of the females to distinguish between vocabulary sizes. And so what's maintaining that huge vocabulary size? We actually have no idea. Just to put it in perspective, mockingbirds have very, very large vocabularies. They are relatives of the brown thrasher, but a brown thrasher's vocabulary on average is 10 times larger than a mockingbird's. Why so large? We don't know. So if sometimes in bird language one sound can have many meanings and sometimes one meaning can have many sounds, it's also true that sometimes it's complicated. And for this, we're going to come back to our favorites, the red-winged blackbirds. We talked about their songs earlier. We're going to now talk about their call notes, in particular, the calls that are known as the alert calls. Now, here's a male red-winged blackbird, and individual male red-winged blackbirds give an awful lot of call notes, most of which sound like chuck, something like some kind of variation on chuck, or a whistled seer. They will give these calls over and over again when they're sitting up on a cattail in the marsh. A lot of males, they nest in these big colonies. A lot of males all around the marsh will be sitting up on the cattails giving these calls. Each individual male knows between 12 and 20 different call notes of this type, most of which sound something like chuck, some of which might sound like seer. So for example, here are a few call notes of a male red-winged blackbird. There's 10 different alert calls of one male red-winged blackbird. That might be half that bird's vocabulary of alert calls. What's interesting is that all the other male red-winged blackbirds in that same marsh know the same 12 to 20 alert calls. They share a vocabulary within their marsh with their neighbors. But if you drive to another marsh 50 miles down the road, you will find that that population of red-winged blackbirds has a different shared vocabulary of 12 to 20 alert calls. What they do, these males, when they're sitting up on these cattails, is they all pick one of the 12 to 20 calls that they know, and they repeat it over and over again. And what researchers noticed is that when danger appears, say when a hawk comes into the picture, the call notes change. And that seemed to suggest an answer to the question, why do red-winged blackbirds have 12 to 20 different alert calls? It seemed like maybe each of those different calls meant something different. Maybe it meant a different kind of predator. Maybe it meant a different direction from which the predator was coming. Or maybe it has to do with the level of danger, how close or how threatening that threat is. So they wanted to start researching this. So they got themselves a stuffed Cooper's hawk and they put it on a stick. And they got themselves a bed sheet and a really long string. And they put the stuffed Cooper's hawk on the stick, put the bed sheet over it, and stuck it in the marsh so they can move this Cooper's hawk all around the marsh with the bed sheet over it. And then they can back up a long ways, wait for everything to calm back down, and then they can whip that bed sheet off. And from the perspective of the red-winged blackbird, it'll be like a Cooper's hawk suddenly appeared right in front of them. And then they would audio record the calls of the red-winged blackbird before and after the hawk appeared. And so they were trying to figure out whether one of these calls might mean Cooper's hawk, for example. So here's how this experiment went. Let's just say this is the call that all the males are giving. One male's giving it, all the other males are echoing it. And then the researchers whip that bed sheet off. The hawk appears. And the call changes. The first male to see the hawk switches to a different call. All the other males within earshot immediately switch over to that same call. So the researchers thought, well, that's very interesting. Let's do it again. They try it again. Before the hawk appears, all the males are giving this call. And then the hawk appears. And they switch to that call. Try again. Before the hawk appears, all the males are giving this call. They whip that bed sheet off. And the males go to that call. And as they did this experiment over and over again, what they discovered is that it doesn't matter which call the males switch to when the hawk appears. What matters is that they switch calls. In other words, any call repeated over and over again in red-winged blackbird language means all clear. And any switch from one call to another means danger. The switch in calls is what carries the message instead of the call itself. And when I learned about this, I was dumbfounded because this is not at all the way that human language works. This is an entirely different method and theory of communication than I was familiar with. We are so accustomed, because of the way our language works, we're so accustomed to the meaning being in the individual words. But here's a language where the individual words are meaningless. And it is only their relationship to other words in time that gives them meaning. It is only the syntax that carries the meaning here, and not the actual words at all. I love using this example because, first of all, the red-winged blackbird is probably the most common native bird in North America. There are billions of them on this continent, and you can hear them any day in the summer that you want. And they're right under our noses, and all of this was going on, and it took us decades and decades to figure this out. There are so many other common birds that we don't know what amazing answers they might have come up with to the challenge of communicating. I've talked about the language of birds in this talk, but it's actually 10,000 different languages, one for each different bird species. They all have a whole bunch of different sounds that they make, and each of them has come up with its own ways of answering that communications challenge. There's so much more to learn about bird sounds, and that's what I find most fascinating about it. And I think a lot of the things we might be able to learn would teach us new things about how communication can be, and how maybe we are not the only ones who have a monopoly on various types of intelligence on this planet. So I'm gonna, right on time, bring the prepared portion of my talks to a close and open it up for anybody to ask me any questions that they would like.
Absolutely. We have a number of questions, Nathan, but before I do that, I usually jump right into the questions. But I just want to say, I'm going to give you a compliment. I've been a Boulder Rotarian for almost 11 years. We have over 40 meetings a year. So I've heard all kinds of presentations. And there are a few times when I come in, I'm not a birder. I don't really care. And your passion and your knowledge has made me rethink, maybe I'm looking at it a different way. And so I just want to thank you personally. This has been wonderful. Our first question goes to Chad. Chad, go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Mike, on your sentiments there. This is really cool. My question is based on your process, and you kind of talked about it a little bit with the hawk and how you pulled back the curtain and witnessed the changes in the calls. But can you describe the process by which you guys determine the language, and at what point would you say, okay, this sound definitely means or translates to this particular meaning?
So let me just clarify that I have not done very much of that type of research firsthand. Everything I just talked to you about today was discovered by other researchers, and I just read about it in scholarly journals. I wasn't in the field. I don't know all the details, but I do know that, when we can say with confidence that what a bird sound means, it's because somebody has done some ingenious field work. That cliff swallow study that I was talking about, that guy that's been going back for 25 straight years to that same colony in Nebraska, they did a very detailed set of experiments to show that call means I've found food. I mean, they went out with sticks and they would beat the bushes literally to kick up swarms of flying insects and get the insects into the air on cold, cloudy days in order to draw the cliff swallows, and then prove that this call was only given under those circumstances. That's the kind of thing you have to do. It takes a long time. It takes many experiments to establish all of this. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't done that work. Nobody's done that work for a lot of the vast majority of even North America's birds, much less the world's.
Great. Thank you, Chad. And what a great entree to my question before we get on to some of the other Boulder Rotarian questions. So we've had the experience even here at Boulder Rotary where we might have an hour meeting and a 30-second clip of like some copyrighted song, the Beatles or whatever it might be. And somehow the algorithm at Google and YouTube finds it. Somehow they see the computer sound wave and they compare it to a whole database of sounds. And of course it's copyrighted and they say, take that out. So I'm just curious how going forward, we might use that technology of also Shazam and Music Match and all these others to advance the work that you're so passionate about.
That's a great question. There are a number of initiatives underway to enable automatic recognition of bird sounds, where you'll be able to hold up your phone to a singing bird, and your phone will be able to tell you what bird is singing. Those apps are already available. You can download some of them for free. The problem right now is that they're not great yet. They're getting better year after year. When they first started coming out about 5 years ago, they were maybe 10% accurate. 9 times out of 10, they would give you a wrong identification. Now they're more like 80 to 90% accurate. And in the next few years, they'll get better. It's a matter of not so much improving the artificial intelligence as it is improving the library of sounds that we use to train the artificial intelligence. We just didn't, until very recently, have enough bird sounds recorded and properly identified to teach the computer how to teach itself.
Okay. Imagine what we're going to know in 5 or 10 years from now. I'm assuming it's geometric, all that data coming in. So great. Well, thanks. And the next question goes to Mark.
Yeah, Nathan, listening to your talk, I was just wondering about if you could comment on birding mimics. I was under the impression that maybe there's birds actually mimicking other birds with calls and sounds, but now I'm thinking, is it possible they just have overly large vocabularies like those mockingbirds, and that's just part of their vocabulary as well? Maybe you could talk about that.
Birds absolutely do imitate other birds. Mockingbirds do, starlings do, a whole bunch of other birds will hear something from another species and then repeat it. And what they're doing is they're not mimicking per se. Mimicry in biology has a particular meaning. Mimicry is like when the viceroy butterfly looks like the monarch butterfly because the monarch is poisonous and the viceroy doesn't want to get eaten. So that's an example of mimicry. That's a case where mimicry is when one organism is trying to disguise itself as another or be mistaken for another. And we're pretty sure that that's not what birds are doing. When a mockingbird imitates a Carolina wren, the last thing that mockingbird wants is to be mistaken for a Carolina wren, because two bad things would happen. One, it would be ignored by all the other mockingbirds, which is not what it wants. And two, it would be attacked by all the Carolina wrens, which is not what it wants. So when a mockingbird imitates a Carolina wren, it takes bits and pieces of the wren song, but then it incorporates them into this larger matrix of mockingbird sounds, so that, you know, the other mockingbirds and all the other Carolina wrens, they can tell that that's just a mockingbird imitating a wren, the same way that we birders know, because if it was actually a wren, it would be singing the same song over and over and over. But if it's a mockingbird, it only goes on for maybe 10 seconds, and then it switches to something else, and then it switches to something else, and then it switches to something else constantly. And so we know that, and so do all the birds in the forest. So the mockingbird is actually using Carolina wren sounds to send the message, I am a mockingbird. So they're doing what human producers do when they remix sounds. When they take a sample from somebody else's song and then put it into their own song, but then put their own sounds around it or put it into their own pattern. The mockingbirds are doing the same thing. They're remixing from nature, but they want to put their own individual creative stamp on what they're remixing.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Gordon. I know you have 2 questions, Gordon, but there's a lot of other people who have questions too. So maybe pick your best one. Okay, Gordon?
Yeah, what do we know about bird emotions and the connection between their language and their emotions? Do they have emotions that humans don't have, or do we presume that the emotions we have are the same that birds have, or what do you know about? I mean, have they done brain scans on birds?
They have done some brain scans on birds. I'm not sure that anybody's really looked into emotions per se. Most researchers don't use the word emotions to talk about animals in general. Animal behaviorists tend to not use that word, but it's very clear that birds have different states, right? There's very clearly alarm. That's a reaction that birds can have. Agitation. It's sometimes difficult to distinguish between the different types of agitation, right? But it's clear that birds have, they get romantically excited, they get agitated in an aggressive way, and they also get agitated in a fearful way. And I'm not sure that we want to put names of human emotions on those. And then of course there's also like calm would be another thing, right? But those are 4 clear states that I think almost every bird shares. And then there's probably shades of those and combinations of those that may or may not map super well onto what we call our own emotions. That's about the best I can tell you on that.
Thank you. All right, next question is past President John Sullivan. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Nathan, that was great. It's been a great presentation. I've read that ravens are generally considered the smartest birds because they have the ability to figure out and solve problems, and they use tools. But your presentation, particularly the part about a bird that has a 2,000-word vocabulary, is causing me to reconsider. Where do ravens fit in to the hierarchy of smart birds?
Well, ravens are more intelligent than we ever knew, and probably more intelligent than we yet know. Ravens are amazing. So are crows. Crows are closely related to ravens. By the way, living in Boulder, we're all lucky because we get to see ravens and crows all the time, about equally often. There's a bunch of ravens that live downtown and also at the university, plus up in the mountains. Ravens and crows can recognize individual human faces. They have a very complex social life. They live in flocks and they all know each other by voice and by sight. They know who each other is. And they have a social hierarchy. There's a top-ranked male and a second-ranked male and a top-ranked female and a second-ranked female all the way on down. And they're constantly jockeying for position. It's very middle school. And if you ever do anything mean to a crow or a raven, they will remember you. If you put on different clothes and come back, they will still recognize you. And not only that, but they can tell each other about what you did and why you're bad. So that ravens and crows that have never seen you before will also start cussing you out when they start seeing you. They're all somehow communicating that to one another using their voices, using some combination of what always just sounds like caw or croak to our ear. There is a lot of communication going on among crows and ravens, and we haven't figured it out yet. They may well have larger vocabularies than that brown thrasher does, but the different phrases in brown thrasher song are obviously different. Somehow in all the cawing and the croaking that crows and ravens do, you can hear different shades, but it all sounds like the same word, just said in a slightly different tone every time that bird calls. But some of those differences must be carrying meaning that human ears are not picking up. It's the same with prairie dogs, by the way. I don't know if you know about what prairie dogs can communicate to one another, but they can communicate an awful lot about the color of the clothing, whether or not somebody has a dog, which direction they're in. Like they can, using just those little barks that all sound the same to our ear, they can communicate different messages about who's coming and where they are and how big the threat is, all to the other prairie dogs in the colony. So crows and ravens are brilliant. They are problem solvers. They are learners. They and parrots are probably at the top of the bird intelligence scale as far as we know. But I think there's a lot we haven't learned about what birds know.
Thank you. And our last question is going to go to John Lehman. John, would you unmute yourself and ask your question?
I'm hard of hearing, so I kind of focus on hearing. And when I was first thinking, I thought, well, do birds hear better than humans? But what you were just saying was, well, maybe they hear differently than humans. That's my question.
They do hear differently than humans. They hear the same frequencies that humans hear. So birds cannot hear bats, for example. Birds cannot hear super high-pitched sounds. Their range of hearing frequencies is about the same as humans. At least a young human who has the full range of hearing, birds can hear about that same range of frequencies. But what they can do is that they hear faster than we do. Their time frequency, their time distinctions are far more precise than ours. So a lot of birds sing a trill. A trill is just the same note repeated really fast, so fast that it just kind of runs into one pulsing sound for our ears, like brrr. We know that birds can hear the individual notes in those really, really fast trills, much, much faster than humans can. Because you can make minute changes in the recording and play it back, and the bird will be able to tell the difference. It'll respond differently to the altered recording. So birds live faster lives. They every second, every minute, they're having more experiences than we are in the same amount of time. That's fascinating, and I don't know quite what that would be like to live that way. But that's not just their hearing; it's also their other senses. But it's definitely something that means they perceive the world differently than we do.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good question. And thank you again, Nathan. I know Merrill Glustrom has something he'd like to say to you as well.
Yes, Dr. Pieplow, Nathan, it's tradition in Rotary for us to get the last word. The honors fallen on me this time, so please accept our thanks for an interesting, entertaining, and enlightening talk about birds and their musical, meaningful speech. I cannot imagine how we could live meaningful lives without the company of our winged friends. They personify wildness in our backyards, parks, and in the Colorado mountains. Talks like yours help us to appreciate how important birds are and that all of us need to protect their environment. For speaking to our club today and giving so generously of your time and expertise, even from Minnesota, we are donating 100 doses of polio vaccine to the Polio Plus campaign. We at Rotary have long made it a priority to rid the world once and for all of the scourge of polio. So please accept our thanks. Thank you.
Thank
Thank-
you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Meryl, and thank you so much, Nathan. That was so fascinating. We really appreciate you being here with us today.